The copper taste of my own blood was the only thing keeping me awake, thick and metallic against the back of my throat. Outside the heavy iron-shod doors of the high citadel, the blizzard howled like a dying god, spitting shards of ice that rattled against the stained glass window panes. I pressed my palm flat against the frozen slate of the corridor wall, the brutal cold biting through the raw scabs and heavy, jagged scars mapping my wrists. My breathing was too shallow, a ragged rhythm that whistled through the quiet space of the grand hallway. Underneath the scent of dust and ancient stone, my nose twitched at the sudden sharp aroma of ozone and wet wolf fur, the unmistakable signature of the Apex enforcers. They were tracking me. Even inside the sovereign neutral territory of the Royal Summit, the executioners of the Obsidian Pack were closing the distance. I tightened my fingers around the rough, frayed edges of my cloak. It was a pathetic thing, coarse, tattered dark wool, stained with the gray grease of refugee camps and torn by briars from 3 kingdoms of running. It smelled of wood smoke, old rain, and the faint, sweet scent of crushed winterberries I used to mask what lay buried deep beneath my skin. To the lords gathering inside the great chamber, I was a ghost. An Omega cast out into the frozen wastes 5 years ago to starve, a nameless piece of trash beneath the boots of the elite. They didn't know about the burning silver current locked behind my ribs, the dormant, suffocating weight of the Purifier bloodline that my dead mother had begged me to hide. They didn't know about the child hidden 3 valleys away in a crumbling cellar, crying from a fever that only the king's royal apothecary could cure. "Stop right there, Stray." The voice was a low, guttural vibration that rippled through the flagstones. 3 massive wolves in human form stepped from the shadows of the vaulted archway, their chest armor gleaming with the sigil of a broken crescent moon. The lead enforcer, a scarred brute named Logan, whose face I remembered from the night of my exile, bared his teeth. The stench of stale sweat and sulfur rolled off him, thick and suffocating. I didn't flinch. I didn't step back. The steel spine my mother gave me before she was slaughtered kept my shoulders perfectly square, my chin lifted just enough to look him in his yellowing eyes. My wolf was dead silent within me, a crushed, motionless shadow, but my human heart beat with a slow, deliberate cadence. "The summit is under sacred truce, Logan," I said, my voice incredibly quiet, yet carrying a steady, terrifying clarity that made his eyes narrow. "Touch me, and you violate the laws of the first alphas. I carry a message for the High Council. Let me pass." Logan laughed, a wet, rattling sound. "A message? Look at you. You smell like a gutter, Evangeline. The alphas of the continent are inside, wearing silks and melted gold, deciding the fate of borders, and you think you can walk in looking like a carcass dragged from the woods? If the cold doesn't kill you, I will." The Alpha King doesn't listen to beggars. He reached out, a heavy, calloused hand tightening around my upper arm. His grip was a vice, crushing the bruised flesh beneath my tattered sleeve. A normal Omega would have screamed, would have whimpered and bared her throat in submission. I merely looked down at his thick, dirty fingers, my expression as cold as the frost creeping up the window glass. "Release me," I whispered. The air between us grew suddenly, inexplicably heavy. The faint scent of pure snow-crest air, crisp, untainted, and ancient, briefly cut through his foul odor. Logan blinked, a flicker of instinctual hesitation crossing his brutal features, but his pride won. He yanked me forward, intending to throw me down the spiraling stone stairs. The heavy oak doors of the great chamber blasted open before he could take another step. The pressure that hit the corridor was instantaneous and crushing. It wasn't the simple dominance of a local alpha. It was in suffocating, absolute weight that dropped Logan and his 2 guards to their knees in a fraction of a second. The stones beneath our feet groaned. The air grew searingly hot, thick with the scent of crushed embers, molten gold, and a terrifyingly pure masculine power that made the hair on my arms stand up. The Beast Alpha King, Maddox Vane. the monarch of the northern wilds, the supreme commander of the united packs, and a man whispered to have torn his own father's throat out to claim the throne before he had even reached his 20th winter. I stayed standing, though my knees trembled violently under the sheer force of his aura. My tattered cloak fluttered against my ankles as a towering figure stepped through the threshold. He was dressed in dark, heavy velvet and midnight silk, gold embroidery tracing the broad, impossible expanse of his shoulders. But there was nothing civilized about him. His jawline was sharp enough to cut stone, shadow-dark stubble framing a mouth set in a grim, unyielding line. His hair was black as a starless night, falling wildly over a forehead that housed two piercing, predatory eyes. Right now, those eyes were glowing a brilliant, terrifying gold. The entire corridor fell into a dead, paralyzed silence. The enforcers pinned to the floor couldn't even lift their chins to look at him. Maddox didn't look at them either. His gaze swept the hallway with lethal indifference until it landed directly on me. And then, the universe shattered. A violent, invisible shockwave tore through my chest, so sudden and agonizingly intense that air gasped from my lungs. It felt as though a dormant furnace inside my soul had been struck by lightning, exploding into white-hot flames that rushed through every vein, every scar, every broken piece of my body. The mate bond. It wasn't a gentle pull. It was a brutal, roaring beast that demanded absolute surrender, a physical tether snapping taut between my fractured soul and his. I saw Maddox freeze. The absolute immobility of his massive frame was terrifying. The golden light in his eyes flared so brightly it looked like liquid fire. His nostrils flared, inhaling deeply, catching the scent of my blood, my cheap winterberry mask, and the hidden, ancient purity of the snowcrest line hiding beneath my rags. His chest heaved once, a massive, ragged breath that mirrored my own. For 5 long seconds, neither of us moved. The lords inside the chamber peered out, their rich silks rustling, their faces pale as they realized the king had stopped dead in his tracks because of a ragged girl in a ruined cloak. Maddox took a step forward. His boots, heavy and adorned with gold buckles, thudded against the stone with a sound like thunder. He ignored his lords. He ignored the enforcers groveling at his feet. His focus was locked entirely on me, his eyes tracking the dark bruises on my exposed wrists, the dirt smudged across my cheek, and the pathetic, frayed wool covering my frame. The dominance radiating from him shifted from oppressive tyranny to a fiercely protective, possessive heat that wrapped around me like a heavy blanket, shielding me from the drafty chill of the castle. When he stopped, he was barely inches away. He towered over me, his shadow swallowing me whole. I could smell the leather of his coat, the rich musk of his skin, and that intoxicating scent of burning embers. My heart was hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird, but I kept my spine straight, my hands steady against my sides, refusing to look down. "Who did this to you?" Maddox asked. His voice was a low, resonant baritone that vibrated straight through my bones, a frequency so deep it felt like a physical touch. He didn't look at the guards, but everyone in the hallway knew exactly who he was asking about. "They are enforcers of the Obsidian Pack, Your Majesty," I said, my voice quiet, completely devoid of the trembling that threatened to tear me apart. "And I am in exile. I have no right to be here. But I hold information that will determine whether your kingdom survives the night." A murmur went through the crowd of lords gathering at the doorway. A rogue Omega speaking to the High King with such calm, unyielding defiance was unheard of. They expected him to strike me down for my insolence. Instead, Maddox's gaze dropped to my hands, tracing the raw, bloody scabs where Logan had grabbed me. The air temperature dropped instantly, a freezing rage replacing the heat of his aura. He didn't say another word to me. He simply turned his head slightly, his golden eyes locking onto Logan, who was still paralyzed on the floor. "You touched what is mine," Maddox murmured, the words so soft they were almost a caress, yet carrying the weight of a death sentence. "Alpha King, please," Logan choked out, his face pressed against the icy slate. "She is a stray, a criminal from our pack." Before Logan could finish, Maddox moved with a speed that defied human sight. There was a sickening crunch of bone, a brief, muffled gurgle, and Logan's body slumped sideways against the wall, his neck broken with a casual, terrifying flick of the king's wrist. The other two enforcers pressed themselves even flatter against the floor, whimpering in absolute terror. Maddox didn't even look at his hands. He turned back to me, the lethal monster vanishing from his eyes, replaced entirely by that fierce, burning devotion that made my knees turn to water. Slowly, deliberately, the most powerful wolf on the continent did something that silenced the entire citadel. He didn't order me to be cleaned. He didn't command his guards to drag me inside. Maddox Vane, the beast Alpha King, sank down onto one knee right there on the dirty, blood-stained stone corridor. He lowered his proud, royal head until he was looking up at me, his massive hands reaching out with agonizing gentleness to take my small, trembling hands into his own warm, scarred palms. He didn't care about the grease on my tattered cloak. He didn't care about the lords watching in absolute horror. "My queen," he whispered, his low voice echoing in the dead silence of the hallway, sending a shiver of pure fire straight down my spine. "Tell me who I need to kill first." The heavy, suffocating silence of the corridor pressed against my ears, so absolute that the crackle of a dying torch on the wall sounded like a shifting glacier. Maddox remained on one knee before me, a dark titan of undisputed power voluntarily bending his spine to a girl who smelled of refuge camps and desperation. His large, scarred hands were shockingly warm against my frozen skin, the heat of his touch bleeding through the scabs on my wrists and igniting that terrifying, white-hot current of the mate bond once more. Behind him, the great doorway of the council chamber was a gallery of frozen, pale faces. The wealthiest lords of the continent, men who traded in thousands of lives and wore silk dyed in the blood of their enemies, stared with wide, uncomprehending eyes. The Alpha King, the beast who had never bowed to God or master, was kneeling in the dirt before an outcast Omega. "Maddox," a sharp, aristocratic voice cut through the stillness. It belonged to Lord Hector, the Grand Elder of the Southern Steppes, his chest heavily decorated with medals of solid silver. He took a cautious step forward, his polished leather boots clicking against the flagstones. "What is the meaning of this madness? This creature is a trespasser. She wears the rags of a common thief, and you disgrace the high throne by kneeling in her filth." The air in the corridor didn't just grow cold, it died. Maddox didn't move a single muscle, but the absolute stillness of his massive frame became infinitely more menacing than any roar. Slowly, his fingers tightened around my hands, not enough to hurt, but with a possessive, unyielding weight that anchored me to the earth. He tilted his head back slightly, his golden eyes sliding away from mine to lock onto the elderly lord. The sheer predator glare was enough to make Hector physically stumble backward, his hand flying instinctively to the hilt of his ceremonial dagger. "If you speak of her again, Hector," Maddox murmured, his voice a low, gravelly vibration that rattled the window panes, "I will peel the skin from your throat and paint the council table with it before your heart stops beating. Choose your next words with that in mind." Hector's jaw tightened, his face turning a mottled, furious purple, but he closed his mouth. No one dared challenge the king's law, especially when the king's wolf was clearly riding the very surface of his skin. Maddox turned his focus back to me, the lethal edge in his gaze melting into an intense, burning hunger that made it difficult to breathe. He rose to his feet in one fluid, terrifyingly graceful motion, towering over me once more. The contrast between us was laughable. him in his pristine midnight velvet and heavy gold, and me in my frayed, dark wool cloak that was stiff with dried mud and smelling faintly of the damp forest. "You are freezing," he noted, his low frequency vibrating against my chest. His gaze dropped to the way my shoulders trembled, a physical reaction to the biting draft I had been trying so hard to ignore. Before I could reply, before my steel spine could formulate a proud refusal, Maddox reached for the silver clasps of his own royal mantle. With a single smooth pull, he removed the heavy, fur-lined velvet cloak that bore the embroidered golden crest of the High Monarch. He stepped closer, invading my space entirely, wrapping the massive garment around my shoulders. It was heavy, so heavy it nearly pulled me down, and it was saturated with his scent. The intoxicating aroma of molten gold, burning embers, and a rich, dark musk overwhelmed my senses, instantly quietening the frantic, exhausted pulse in my throat. "I don't need your coat, Alpha King," I whispered, my voice quiet but perfectly steady, refusing to let the warmth soften the walls I had spent 5 years building. "I need your ears, and I need your protection for what is to come." "You have both." "Forever," he replied, his hand lingering near my cheek, his thumb brushing a fraction of an inch away from my skin, as if he were practicing the restraint required not to break a delicate glass doll. "But first, we walk into my chamber. Together." He turned, offering me his arm. The dark velvet of his sleeve was immaculate, a stark contrast to my dirty, calloused fingers. For a split second, the image of my son, his pale, feverish face hidden in that damp cellar miles away, flashed behind my eyes. I couldn't afford pride. I couldn't afford to run anymore. I needed the power this man held, even if the mate bond threatened to consume everything I was. I placed my hand on his forearm. The muscles beneath the fabric were hard as iron, flexing slightly at my touch. As we stepped through the threshold into the great chamber, a collective gasp rippled through the assembled nobility. The room was a massive amphitheater of carved black stone, illuminated by dozens of iron chandeliers, dripping with beeswax and tallow. At the center stood the grand council table, a massive slab of petrified wood ringed by thrones of gold and bone. Maddox didn't lead me to a seat among the low-ranking delegates. He walked straight to the dais, toward the massive throne of dark iron that sat at the absolute head of the room. With a gentle but unyielding pressure, he guided me to step up onto the platform. "Maddox, this is completely against the protocol of the Great Pact," cried out Alpha Gideon, the ruler of the Obsidian Pack, the very pack that had branded me an outcast and hunted me like an animal. He stood at the far end of the table, his fingers digging into the wood, his eyes wild with a mixture of rage and sudden, creeping panic as he recognized my face beneath the hood. "That girl is an escaped slave of my house, a broken Omega who committed treason against her own blood. By the laws of the first Alphas, she belongs to me for judgment." The silence that followed was heavy with the smell of old copper and ozone. I stepped forward, letting Maddox's royal cloak slide slightly off my left shoulder, revealing the tattered wool beneath, and the jagged silver-white scar that ran from the base of my neck down into the dark fabric. The mark of a Purifier, though to them it looked like a failed executioner's brand. "Your house is built on a foundation of rotting meat, Gideon," I said. My voice wasn't loud, but in the acoustic perfection of the stone chamber, it cut through the murmurs like a honed blade. I felt Maddox shift behind me, his presence a towering wall of heat and lethal intent, ready to shred anyone who dared move toward me. "You call me a traitor because I discovered what you hid in the dark iron mines of the western border. You call me broken because I survived the winter you left me to die in." Gideon's eyes narrowed, a bead of sweat tracing the line of his heavy jaw. "You are a liar, a mad stray grasping at straws to save your own pathetic skin." "Am I?" I reached into the hidden folds of my tattered cloak. my fingers brushing against the cold, smooth texture of what I had carried across 3 borders. I pulled out a heavy, blood-stained leather ledger, its edges scorched by fire, bound with a seal that bore the crest of the rebel northern factions, the very enemies Maddox had been fighting for 3 winters. I didn't throw it. I stepped up to the edge of the dais, my gaze locked directly onto Gideon's pale face. "This contains the trade agreements, signed in your own blood, Gideon," I said, the steel in my voice absolute. "You didn't banish me because I was a useless Omega. You banished me because I saw the crates of silver-tipped weapons you were buying from the human syndicates to smuggle into the king's capital. You were planning to slaughter the royal lineage tonight during the closing banquet." A roar of outrage erupted from the lords, chairs scraping violently against the stone floor as alphas reached for their weapons. The scent of fear, anger, and raw wolf aggression flooded the room, thick enough to choke. But before a single lord could draw a blade, Gideon moved. Realizing his treason was laid bare, his eyes turned completely black as his inner wolf took control. With a feral snarl that shook the chandeliers, he vaulted over the massive petrified wood table, his claws extending, his target directly at my throat. He was fast, faster than any ordinary alpha, but he wasn't the king. Maddox didn't even draw a weapon. He stepped in front of me so quickly my eyes couldn't register the motion, his large hand snapping out like a striking viper. His fingers caught Gideon by the throat mid-air, stopping the 300-pound alpha's momentum instantly. The impact sounded like a cannon shot. Gideon choked, his legs dangling off the ground as Maddox lifted him effortlessly with one arm. The king's golden eyes burned with an ancient, primordial fury that made the air in the room vibrate with suffocating power. "You dared to dream of her death," Maddox whispered, the low frequency of his voice causing several wine glasses on the table to shatter into crystalline shards. "You dared to hunt my mate in my own house." Gideon thrashing was useless. The king's grip was a vice of solid iron. But as I watched the traitor choke, a sudden sharp pain flared deep within my own chest. A violent, icy shudder from my suppressed wolf that had nothing to do with the mate bond. A warning. Outside the high stained glass windows, a massive, deafening explosion rocked the foundations of the citadel. The glass shattered inward, raining deadly shards of colored crystal down onto the grand council table. The world disintegrated into a chaos of screaming stone and flying glass. The deafening roar of the blast blew out 3 of the massive iron chandeliers, plunging the grand chamber into a suffocating twilight, illuminated only by the dancing orange tongues of sudden fires. The scent of sulfur, burning fat, and the choking dust of pulverized granite instantly obliterated the clean, sharp aroma of the winterberries I had used to hide myself. Through the haze of smoke, the physical weight of Maddox's aura shifted from a protective shield into a lethal, crushing shockwave that forced several lesser lords to their knees. He didn't drop Alpha Gideon. Instead, with a brutal, casual flick of his wrist, the king slammed the traitor's head down onto the edge of the petrified wood table. The wood splintered with a wet, heavy crack, and Gideon's body slumped to the floor, motionless and bleeding profusely from a broken skull. "Guards, lock down the perimeter!" Lord Hector's voice screeched through the dust, his aristocratic calm entirely shattered. "The rebel factions, they've breached the lower gates!" Shouts and the heavy clatter of armored boots echoed from the dark corridors outside. But inside the chamber, the air remained completely paralyzed. My heart hammered violently against my ribs, a frantic rhythm that threatened to break through my forced composure. The explosion hadn't just shaken the castle, it had shattered the delicate seals around my own suppressed power. Deep within my chest, beneath the heavy scars and the years of forced silence, my dormant wolf stirred. It wasn't the wild, frantic beast of a regular Omega. It was a cold, silver light, the ancient heritage of the Purifier bloodline waking up, in response to the massive threat. Maddox turned to me instantly, ignoring the shouting lords and the smoke rising from the shattered windows. His golden eyes were glowing so fiercely they seemed to cut through the gray dust like twin lanterns. He walked back up the dais, his heavy boots crushing the shards of stained glass with a sound like breaking bones. "Evangeline," he murmured, his low baritone a steady anchor in the middle of the madness. He reached out, his massive, scarred hand cupping the side of my neck, his thumb resting directly over my frantic pulse. The touch was a jolt of pure electricity, a searing heat that locked my gaze to his. "You knew this was coming. The ledger. This wasn't just a political play. You came here because you knew they were already at the gates." I looked up at him, my spine rigid, refusing to let the trembling of my limbs show. "The ledger details the timing of the strike, Alpha King. Gideon was only the inside piece. The main force of the Silver Syndicate rebels has been waiting in the lower catacombs for 3 days. They don't just want your throne. They want to cleanse the city." Before Maddox could answer, the heavy, iron-shod doors of the chamber were blasted off their hinges, flying inward and crushing 2 guards who had been trying to barricade them. Through the ruined threshold poured a tide of men clad in dark, non-reflective iron armor, their faces hidden behind grotesque wolf masks made of rusted steel. They didn't carry traditional blades. They held heavy, mechanical crossbows loaded with thick bolts that shimmered with a deadly pale blue light. Liquid silver, the ultimate weapon against our kind, designed to poison the blood and rot a wolf from the inside out within minutes. "Protect the king!" Hector yelled, but his command was cut short as a silver-tipped bolt pierced his chest, the old lord collapsing with a strangled scream as black veins instantly began to web outward from the wound across his throat. The room erupted into a savage, close-quarters slaughter. The lords, stripped of their fine silks by the reality of teeth and claws, began to shift into their massive wolf forms, their roars shaking the rafters. But the silver weapons were devastatingly efficient. For every rebel that was torn apart by a 300-pound beast, 2 alphas fell, their blood hissing as it touched the poisoned metal. Maddox didn't shift. A king of his lineage didn't need to bared teeth to be a monster. He moved in front of me like a wall of living shadow, his broad shoulders entirely blocking my view of the oncoming attackers. A rebel lunged up the steps of the dais, a silver dagger aimed at Maddox's flank. Without looking, the king caught the man's wrist, twisting it until the bones shattered through the skin, then drove the rebel's own poisoned blade deep into his throat. The scent of fresh copper, burning hair, and the foul, rotting odor of silver poisoning filled the air, making my stomach turn. I stepped back against the cold iron of the throne, my hands tightening around the edges of Maddox's heavy velvet cloak. My child. The thought struck me like a physical blow, cold and clarifying. If the citadel fell, if these rebels took the valley, the crumbling cellar 3 miles away would become a tomb. My son, with his fragile chest and his premature wolf, wouldn't survive the night without the royal medicine I had come to bargain for. I couldn't let Maddox die here. I couldn't let this kingdom burn. "Maddox!" I called out, my voice cutting through the din of battle, perfectly calm despite the blood spraying across the stone steps. "The central pillar behind the throne, it connects to the lower drainage vaults. If you drop the iron portcullis, you can bottle them in the corridor." Maddox paused mid-strike, his hand embedded in the chest of another attacker. He looked back at me over his shoulder, a dark, lethal grin breaking through the mask of his fury. A tactical mind beneath a tattered cloak. I chose well. He ripped his hand free, letting the corpse fall, and lunged toward the heavy bronze lever set into the wall behind the dais. But as his fingers closed around the metal, 3 rebels fired their crossbows simultaneously from the shadows of the gallery above. Time seemed to slow down to a crawl. I saw the 3 silver bolts tracing lines through the thick smoke, their blue tips aiming directly for Maddox's unprotected back while his focus was on the lever. He was fast, but he couldn't dodge all three from that angle. My suppressed wolf didn't roar, it shattered its cage. The silver current that had been locked behind my ribs for 5 years burst forward, a blinding, incandescent wave of white light that erupted from my skin. The sheer force of the energy blew my hood back entirely, revealing my face to the entire room, my porcelain skin glowing with faint silver veins, my eyes turned into pools of absolute starlight white. The 3 silver bolts didn't hit Maddox. They struck an invisible, shimmering barrier of pure lunar energy 3 inches from his spine, the metal turning red-hot and melting into harmless drops of liquid before hitting the floor. The entire chamber went dead silent for the 2nd time that night. Even the rebels froze, their rusted steel masks tilting upward as they looked at me. The light radiating from my body wasn't the dark, heavy aggression of an alpha. It was the ancient, purifying warmth of the Moonborn, a mythic bloodline thought to have been extinct for 3 centuries, capable of neutralizing the deadliest silver poisons. Maddox turned slowly, his hand still on the lever. The golden fire in his eyes met the starlight white of mine, and for the first time, I saw a flicker of something resembling awe cross his rugged, bloody features. He felt it, the true depth of who I was. Not a broken omega, not a stray to be pitied. His true mate, his equal. "A purifier," Lord Gideon choked out from the floor, still clinging to life despite his crushed skull, his fingers leaving bloody streaks on the stone. "The child, she was the one we missed." Maddox didn't let him finish. He slammed the bronze lever down. A massive iron portcullis crashed down from the ceiling, sealing the main doorway and cutting off the flow of rebel reinforcements. But the victory was short-lived. The 3 rebels in the gallery above realized what I was, and their expressions turned from shock to pure fanatical hatred. They didn't care about the king anymore. A purifier alive meant the end of their silver poison weapons forever. They reloaded their mechanical bows, their movements frantic, pointing the heavy shafts directly at my chest. Maddox roared, a sound so primal and monstrous it tore the remaining tapestries from the walls, and lunged across the dais to cover my body with his own. But before he could reach me, the floor beneath the Iron Throne, weakened by the previous explosion, groaned loudly and collapsed into the dark abyss below, dragging me down into the blackness of the catacombs. The fall was a vertical plunge into a freezing subterranean nightmare. The roaring chaos of the council chamber above was instantly replaced by the rush of stale, damp air and the terrifying sensation of weightlessness. I plummeted into the darkness, the heavy velvet of Maddox's royal cloak billowing around me like a broken wing. My body hit a steeply sloping stone chute, an old medieval refuse tunnel beneath the citadel. The impact knocked the remaining breath from my lungs, a sharp agony radiating through my ribs as I tumbled over rough, wet granite. I slid through the pitch-black void, skin scraping against moss and jagged stone, before violently breaking through a thick curtain of rotted roots and crashing onto a hard, flooded floor. For a long minute, there was only the sound of my own ragged, whistling breath and the steady, hollow drip, drip, drip of condensation echoing in the dark. I lay flat on my back in an inch of ice-cold, stagnant water. Every muscle in my body screamed in protest, and the iron taste of blood was thick on my tongue again. But as I forced my eyes open, staring up into the jagged hole 20 feet above, the starlight white glow of my purifier blood was already beginning to recede, leaving behind a cold, numbing ache. My suppressed wolf was retreating into her dark cage, exhausted by the sudden, violent burst of ancient magic. "Evangeline!" The voice echoed down the stone chute, a low, desperate roar that vibrated through the very foundations of the catacombs. Maddox. It wasn't the voice of a king commanding a subject. It was the sound of a wounded beast whose heart had just been ripped from his chest. The raw panic in his baritone frequency made the stagnant water around me ripple. "Maddox, I tried to call back, but my voice was a broken whisper, swallowed instantly by the vast emptiness of the cavern. I struggled to my elbows, my fingers sinking into the thick, greasy mud of the floor. The scent here was foul, a suffocating mixture of ancient rot, damp slate, and the faint, unmistakable sting of fresh sulfur. My eyes, slowly adjusting to the gloom, traced the architecture of the space. I was in the lower vaults, a forgotten labyrinth of catacombs built by the first alphas before the citadel was erected above. A sudden, sharp scrape of iron against stone made my spine go entirely rigid. From the shadows of a vaulted archway 30 paces ahead, 2 figures emerged. They wore the same dark, non-reflective iron armor and rusted steel wolf masks as the rebels above. But these weren't common foot soldiers. The heavy, rhythmic thud of their boots and the sheer breadth of their shoulders betrayed them. They were alpha-level turncoats, mercenaries who had traded their loyalty for silvered gold. One of them carried a heavy iron torch that cast a flickering, sickly orange light over the damp walls. The other held a massive, double-handed executioner's blade, its edge gleaming with a faint bluish hue. Liquid silver plating. "Look what fell out of the sky," the one with the blade muttered, his voice muffled by the steel mask. He took a slow, deliberate step forward, the water splashing softly around his boots. "The stray from the council chamber, the one who stopped the bolts." "The Purifier," the second rebel whispered, his tone dropping into a fanatical, reverent hatred. "Gideon said the line was dead. If she stays alive, our master's weapons are useless. Kill her. Cut the head off and burn the corpse before the king finds a way down." I scrambled backward, my boots slipping in the mud, until my back hit the cold, unforgiving stone of a collapsed pillar. I was trapped. My body was battered, my inner wolf was drained and silent, and the heavy velvet cloak Maddox had given me was soaked through, weighing me down like lead. But as the mercenary raised his massive silver blade, the image of my son's pale face flashed vividly in my mind. Leo, my little boy, shivering in that dark cellar 3 miles away, waiting for his mother to bring back the royal elixir. If I died here, he would die alone in the dark. The thought triggered a cold, absolute clarity within me. The steel spine didn't bend to fear. "You think you can kill an ancient line with rusted iron and stolen silver?" I said. My voice didn't tremble. It was incredibly quiet, carrying a chilling, resonant authority that echoed off the vaulted ceiling. I stood up slowly, using the stone pillar to support my weight, letting Maddox's heavy cloak drop into the water. "Your masters are fools, and you are ghosts walking into a grave." The mercenary hesitated for a fraction of a second, intimidated by the sheer lack of fear in an unarmed, bleeding Omega. Then, with a guttural snarl, he lunged forward, swinging the silver blade in a horizontal arc meant to take my head. I didn't try to dodge the blade. Instead, I drove my right hand into the hidden pocket of my tattered wool cloak beneath, my fingers closing around a small, cracked glass vial I had stolen from the Obsidian Pack's alchemist years ago. I smashed the vial against the stone pillar. A dense, blinding cloud of volatile phosphorus and dried wolfsbane dust exploded between us. The mercenary screamed as the toxic powder hit his exposed eyes through the slits of his steel mask, his swing going wild and burying the silver blade deep into the wooden support beam of the old archway. The second rebel cursed, dropping his torch into the water, plunging the cavern into near total darkness, except for the faint, smoky glow of the burning phosphorus. He lunged blind through the smoke, his massive, calloused hand clamping around my throat. He lifted me off my feet, slamming my head against the stone pillar. Shards of white light exploded behind my eyes, the taste of copper flooding my mouth again as he squeezed, cutting off my air. "Pathetic Omega," he hissed into my ear, his breath smelling of stale meat and cheap ale. "Your magic won't save you now." I couldn't breathe. My vision was tunneling into blackness, my hands feebly tearing at his iron gauntlets. But just as my conscious mind began to slip away, a sound echoed through the catacombs that made the rebels' grip falter. It was a sound of pure, primordial terror, a deafening, bone-shattering crash from the stone chute behind us. The stone structure didn't just crack, it exploded. A massive, towering silhouette burst through the debris, a cloud of dust and pulverized rock flying outward like shrapnel. Maddox hadn't looked for us stairs. He had thrown himself down the vertical chute to reach me. The king was no longer entirely human. His jaw had elongated, exposing rows of razor-sharp ivory fangs that gleamed in the dim light. His fingernails had extended into 3-inch obsidian claws, and his upper body had swollen with pure, monstrous muscle, tearing the fine midnight silk of his royal shirt to ribbons. The golden fire in his eyes was blinding, radiating a heat so intense it literally evaporated the water around his heavy boots. The rebel holding my throat didn't even have time to scream. Maddox closed the distance between them in a heartbeat. His obsidian claws tore through the rebel's iron chest plate as if it were wet paper, gripping the man's breastbone and ripping him completely away from me. With a single savage heave, the king hurled the 300-pound mercenary across the cavern. The body hit the far wall with a sickening smash of shattering bones and fell lifeless into the mud. I collapsed to the floor, coughing violently, my hands clutching my bruised throat as air rushed back into my lungs. The remaining rebel, his eyes still burning from the wolfsbane dust, looked at the king and completely lost his mind to fear. He dropped to his knees, his hands shaking as he tried to pull his silver dagger from his belt. Maddox didn't give him the chance. He stepped forward, his heavy boot coming down on the rebel's arm, crushing the bones of his wrist into the stone floor with a horrific crunch. The king leaned down, his fangs inches away from the man's terrified face, his voice a low, demonic rattle that belonged to the first beast. "Who sent you into the catacombs?" Maddox growled, the sheer frequency of his voice making the rebel vomit blood from internal pressure. "Speak, or I will feed you your own spine." The elder," the rebel gasped out, his eyes rolling back. "Lord Hector, he was only the distraction. The main faction, they aren't just taking the castle, they went for the valleys. They are purging the refugee camps, the half-blood children." My heart stopped beating. The world went completely white. The refugee camps, the valleys. Leo. I scrambled to my feet, ignoring the agony in my ribs, my steel spine cracking with a desperate, terrifying strength. I grabbed Maddox's shredded sleeve, my fingers sinking into his hard muscle, forcing his massive, golden-eyed gaze away from the dying rebel and directly onto me. "Maddox, listen to me," I whispered, my voice carrying a sharp, desperate clarity that cut right through his battle rage. "We have to go. Now. The ledger, I didn't tell you everything. The rebels aren't just after your throne. They are looking for a child, my child. And if they find him, they will slaughter every living soul in that valley to hide what he is." The name Leo hung in the damp, sulphurous air of the catacombs like a drop of cold poison. Maddox's entire body went rigid, the monstrous, half-shifted contours of his face, the protruding fangs, the shadow-dark fur bristling along his sharp jawline, stilled into an expression of raw, unadulterated shock. The golden fire in his eyes flared so intensely it cast long, dancing shadows against the ancient stone arches. A child. His true mate, the mythic Purifier he had just found after years of empty ruling, had a child. And that child was currently in the crosshairs of a genocidal rebel faction. Behind us, the crushed mercenary let out a wet, rattling breath before his head rolled to the side, dead. The heavy silence of the lower vaults returned, broken only by the frantic, shallow rhythm of my own breathing, and the steady drip, drip of water from the ceiling. "A child," Maddox repeated. The low baritone of his voice was no longer a battle roar. It was a dark, dangerous whisper that vibrated straight through the stone floor beneath my boots. His obsidian claws slowly retracted, his large hands trembling slightly as he turned fully toward me. The possessive, protective heat of his aura suddenly flared with a wild, chaotic desperation. "You have a child, Evangeline?" "He is 3 winters old," I said, my voice echoing with a terrifying, absolute calm, the steel spine that kept me from collapsing even as my lungs burned for air. I didn't look down. I didn't apologize. I kept my starlight white gaze locked onto his glowing gold eyes. "He is frail, Maddox. His wolf is premature, locked behind a chest fever that is killing him. He is hidden in a cellar near the border of the Western Valley. If Hector's men are purging the camps, they are already there." Maddox's gaze dropped to my throat, where the blackening bruises of the rebel's grip were already starting to heal, bathed in the faint residual silver light of my waking bloodline. He didn't ask who the father was. In the primal, absolute law of the mate bond, it didn't matter. The bond didn't care about pasts or scars or the years we had spent apart in the dark. It cared only about survival. It cared about what was ours. "Then we burn the valley to the ground," Maddox murmured. He stepped closer, his massive frame swallowing the space between us. Without another word, he scooped his royal velvet cloak from the muddy water, shaking off the loose debris with a single violent snap of his arm. He wrapped it back around my shoulders, his hands lingering on my collarbones for a fraction of a second. The rich, intoxicating scent of molten gold and burning embers on the fabric immediately swaddled me, fighting off the bone-deep chill of the catacombs. "Can you run?" he asked, his golden eyes scanning my battered face, tracing the small cut on my lip. "I've been running for 5 years, Alpha King," I whispered, a dark, humorless smile touching my lips. "I don't know how to do anything else." "You don't run alone anymore," he growled. Maddox turned toward the dark eastern corridor of the vaults, a path that led away from the citadel and directly toward the mountain passes. With a low, guttural click in the back of his throat, he sent a short-range alpha frequency through the stone walls, a silent command to the loyal royal guards still fighting in the chambers above. "Hold the line. The king has left the castle." We moved through the darkness like 2 ghosts. Maddox didn't shift into his full wolf form. The low ceilings of the catacombs were too narrow for a beast of his size. Instead, he maintained a terrifying half-shift, his speed and agility bordering on the supernatural. I ran at his flank, the heavy royal cloak flying behind me, my boots splashing through the ice-cold water. Every stride was agony, my cracked ribs protested with every breath, and the silver current inside my chest was completely dormant, leaving my human body weak and exhausted. But the image of Leo, his tiny, pale hand clutching a ragged blanket, kept my legs moving. 10 minutes of frantic navigating through the subterranean maze brought us to a heavy iron grate that opened into the rocky ravines behind the citadel. Maddox didn't waste time looking for a mechanism. He raised his heavy, gold-buckled boot and kicked the iron bars. The metal shrieked, the hinges tearing out of the ancient stone mortar as the entire grate flew outward into the snow. The biting wind of the blizzard hit us instantly, a wall of white ice that cut through the smoke and sweat of the catacombs. We emerged onto a narrow, treacherous mountain path. Below us, the valley stretched out like a vast, dark canvas, illuminated by the distant, horrifying orange glow of burning settlements. The Western Valley was on fire. "The refugee camps," I choked out, the freezing air cutting into my throat. The scent of pramokshia shirst, wet wolf fur, burning thatch, and the sharp, chemical sting of liquid silver drifted up the mountain on the wind. It was a scent profile I knew too well. The slaughter had begun. Maddox stood at the edge of the precipice, the wind tearing at his dark hair and his shredded silk shirt. His chest heaved as he inhaled the scent of the valley, his jaw clenching so hard the muscles bunched like iron cables. "They brought silver-tipped siege weapons," Maddox noted, his voice dropping into a register so low it was almost swallowed by the howling wind. "They aren't just looking for rebels, Evangeline. They are erasing evidence of their own existence. If my lords see me abandon the capital for a camp of outcasts—" "They will call you a traitor to the high throne," I finished for him, my voice steady despite the absolute terror clawing at my throat. I stepped up beside him, the tattered wool of my inner dress visible beneath his grand cloak. "They will say the Beast King lost his mind for a stray Omega. You should stay. We claim your citadel." Maddox turned his head slowly, his golden eyes burning with a terrifying, absolute devotion that made my breath catch. He reached out, his thick, calloused fingers gently capturing my jaw, forcing me to look up into his fierce, rugged face. His thumb brushed against my lower lip, his touch a searing, chaotic contrast to the freezing snow falling around us. "Let them call me what they want," Maddox whispered, his low baritone cutting through the blizzard like a honed blade. "The throne is a pile of cold iron. You are my blood. You are my breath. If your child is in that valley, then my son is in that valley. And I will tear the world apart before I let them touch him." The mate bond flared between us, a sudden, blinding spike of physical heat that made my inner wolf give a faint, distant cry of acceptance. He was claiming my child as his own lineage, without hesitation, without doubt. Before I could answer, a low, ominous rumble echoed from the pine forests below the path. Through the thick curtain of falling snow, a dozen pairs of glowing red and yellow eyes materialized. These weren't men in masks. These were full-grown, heavily armored wolves, the elite shock troops of the Obsidian Pack, Gideon's personal guard, who had been stationed along the mountain passes to ensure no one escaped the citadel alive. The lead wolf, a massive gray beast with a silver-plated collar around its thick neck, stepped onto the path, its fangs bared, a low, wet snarl rattling in its chest. It smelled of fresh copper and old sweat. Maddox didn't flinch. He didn't step back. He slowly let go of my jaw, stepping out in front of me, his massive shoulders completely blocking the wind. The golden light in his eyes expanded until his pupils were entirely swallowed by the fire. "Stay behind me, Evangeline," he commanded, his voice a low, rhythmic frequency that vibrated through the snow beneath our feet. "And hold on to my cloak. This will not take long." The gray wolf lunged, its massive jaws snapping shut inches from Maddox's face as three more beasts followed, their claws tearing up the frozen slate of the path. The king didn't wait. With a primal roar that drowned out the sound of the blizzard, Maddox Vane threw himself into the pack, his obsidian claws ready to paint the white snow in crimson. The mountain path became an altar of meat and iron. Maddox did not fight like a man. He moved like a localized catastrophe, a primordial force of the first alphas reawakened in flesh. The lead gray wolf never even completed its descent. Mid-air, Maddox's right hand shot out, his obsidian claws sinking through the creature's thick, silver-plated collar and directly into its windpipe. With a sickening, wet wrench, he ripped the beast's throat completely free, spraying a violent arc of hot, smoking crimson across the pristine white snow. Before the carcass could hit the frozen slate, the king pivoted on his heel, his heavy boot catching a second charging wolf directly in the ribs. The impact sounded like a tree trunk snapping in a gale. The 300-pound beast was launched off the cliff face, its terrified, echoing yelp fading into the white abyss of the blizzard below. The remaining 10 wolves of the Obsidian Guard hesitated, their massive paws digging into the ice, their ears pinning back as the scent of their alpha-level brothers' sudden deaths hit their nostrils. They smelled the ozone, the molten gold, and the terrifying, suffocating dominance of the Beast King riding the winter air. "Is that all Gideon taught you?" Maddox murmured. His voice was incredibly low, a resonant, demonic baritone that seemed to rise from the very belly of the mountain. He stood in the center of the narrow path, his shredded silk shirt covered in dark blood that wasn't his chest heaving with a slow, controlled cadence. He didn't even lift his hands to a defensive posture. He simply stared them down with twin pools of liquid gold fire. To hunt females and children in the dark and tremble when a man faces you? A massive black wolf, scarred across the snout, tried to circle around his flank, its eyes darting toward where I stood, pressed against the stone wall. My hand gripped the heavy velvet of Maddox's cloak, my knuckles white, my steel spine keeping me perfectly motionless. I didn't give them the satisfaction of a whimper. My starlight white gaze locked onto the black wolf, and for a split second, a fraction of the Purifier current leaked from my skin, a cold silver frost instantly coating the stones around my boots. The black wolf flinched, its predatory instinct warning it that there was something ancient, something fundamentally lethal to its kind, hiding beneath my tattered wool hood. "Look at her," Maddox growled, his attention shifting to the black wolf. The air temperature around him dropped instantly. "Look closely. You are looking at your new moon queen, and you will die knowing you drew blood in her presence." With a roar that tore the remaining frost from the pine branches above, Maddox lunged. What followed was not a duel, it was an execution. He moving with such blinding, supernatural velocity that the wolves couldn't track his movements in the blinding snow. His hands were blurs of silver and shadow. He caught one wolf by the upper and lower jaws, ripping its skull apart with a casual, terrifying display of raw muscle. He drove his elbow into the skull of another, crushing the bone into the brain matter with a wet thud. The scent of fresh copper and the heavy, sulphurous stench of dying beasts became so thick it coated the back of my throat. Within 2 minutes, the path was a graveyard of dark fur and crimson snow. The last remaining rebel, the black wolf, now limping heavily from a severed hamstring, backed away, its tail tucked between its legs, its chest heaving in absolute terror as it realized it was the last one left alive. Maddox didn't chase it. He walked slowly toward it, his heavy gold buckles clicking against the stones, his obsidian claws dripping slowly onto the ice. He stopped a foot away, leaning down until his fangs were visible to the trembling creature. "Go back to your masters in the valley," Maddox whispered, the low frequency of his voice causing the wolf to leak urine onto the snow. "Tell them the king is coming. Tell them to count their remaining breaths." The black wolf turned and fled, disappearing down the mountain pass like a shadow. Maddox stood still for a long moment, his back to me, his shoulders rising and falling with his heavy breathing. The battle rage was still humming through his veins, a dark, heavy pressure that made the very air vibrate. Slowly, he turned around. The monstrous contours of his half-shift began to recede, his fangs shortening, though his eyes remained a fierce, untamed gold. He walked over to me, his boots leaving bloody prints in the snow. He didn't say a word. He reached out with his large, warm hand, his fingers surprisingly gentle as they brushed a stray lock of dark hair away from my frozen forehead. His touch was a jolt of pure fire against my skin, the mate bond singing a high, frantic note of relief through my chest. "We have no time," I said, my voice quiet but perfectly steady, refusing to let the shock of the slaughter break my focus. "The black wolf will warn them, but the main force is already at the refugee lines. The cellar, it's located beneath the old grain mill at the eastern fork of the river. If the fire reaches the timber, the structure will collapse on him." "Then we don't use the path," Maddox said, his gaze dropping to the valley below. Before I could ask what he meant, he wrapped his massive arms around my waist, pulling me tightly against his hard, iron-like chest. The scent of burning embers and rich musk enveloped me completely as he lifted me off my feet. "Hold your breath, Evangeline," he murmured into my ear, his voice a low vibration that sent a shiver down my spine. Maddox vaulted over the edge of the cliff. We plummeted through the gray twilight of the canyon, a terrifying, exhilarating drop through the howling wind. But instead of crashing into the rocks, Maddox used the ancient pine trees lining the gorge. He landed heavily on a massive branch 50 feet down, the timber groaning under our combined weight, then instantly launched himself to another, using the forest canopy to break our descent with impossible, predatory grace. When we finally hit the valley floor, the snow was deeper, thick and heavy, gray with the soot of the burning camps. The scene before us was a living purgatory. The refugee settlement, a collection of crude timber cabins and canvas tents where the outcasts of 3 packs lived, was entirely engulfed in flames. The screams of women and children echoed through the trees, mixed with the harsh, mocking laughter of Gideon's turncoat mercenaries. 2 ironclad soldiers stood near the riverbank, their mechanical crossbows loaded with liquid silver bolts, driving a line of kneeling, terrified Omegas toward the freezing water. Among them were children, their small bodies shivering, their eyes wide with the reflection of the fires. "Please," an elderly woman wept, her hands raised in supplication. "We have nothing. We are just outcasts." "You are filth," the lead mercenary hissed, lifting his silver blade. "And the order is to leave nothing alive." He raised the blade to strike. A bolt of pure, blinding silver energy blasted through the smoke, striking the mercenary directly in the center of his chest armor. The impact didn't just pierce the metal, it exploded into an incandescent white flame that vaporized the liquid silver on his blade and turned his armor into molten slag within a second. He didn't even have time to scream before he collapsed into a pile of gray ash. The second soldier spun around, his crossbow raised, his eyes wide behind his steel mask. Through the curtain of fire and smoke walked Maddox Vane. His velvet cloak was gone. He had left it wrapped securely around my shoulders as I stepped out from the shadows of the tree line beside him. He walked with a slow, deliberate, lethal grace, his chest bare to the freezing wind, his porcelain skin glowing with the reflection of the burning valley. But the mercenaries weren't looking at the king. They were looking at me. The tattered wool hood had fallen back from my face. My eyes were no longer human. They were 2 pools of brilliant starlight white radiance, and the silver veins of the Purifier line were mapping themselves across my cheeks, pulsing with an ancient, holy power that literally pushed the smoke and heat of the fires back, creating a 10-foot circle of pure, clean winter air around us. "The Purifier," the remaining mercenary whispered. His hands trembling so violently, he dropped his crossbow into the snow. She's alive. "And she is not alone," I said, my voice carrying that quiet, steel clarity that echoed louder than the roaring flames. Maddox stepped in front of me, his golden eyes locking onto the mercenary, his voice dropping into that terrifyingly low frequency that signaled the end of all things. "Where is the grain mill?" The mercenary did not answer with words. His terror spoke for him as he physically stumbled backward into the half-frozen river, his heavy iron boots splashing through the dark, icy water. He pointed a trembling, gauntleted finger toward the eastern fork of the valley, where the tree line ended and the jagged silhouette of a massive timber structure loomed against the crimson sky. The old grain mill. It was already entirely engulfed in a cruel orange inferno. The ancient oak beams, dried by decades of dust and friction, were feeding the flames with a ravenous hunger. Thick, oily black smoke billowed from the shattered roof, carrying the scent of burning grain, charred pine, and something far more terrifying: the sharp chemical sting of liquid silver being sprayed onto the foundations to ensure nothing survived. "Leo!" The name tore from my throat, breaking through my carefully guarded composure, a fragile fracture in my steel spine. The white-hot current of my Purifier blood surged violently in response to my panic. The starlight radiance emanating from my skin flared outward, a physical shockwave of lunar energy that hissed as it collided with the falling snow, instantly vaporizing the flakes into a fine, shimmering mist. I didn't wait for Maddox. I didn't wait for his royal guards or his tactical assessment. I lunged forward into the deep snow, my boots tearing through the gray drifts, my hands gripping the damp edges of the king's velvet cloak as I ran toward the burning mill. "Evangeline, stay behind me!" Maddox's baritone roared through the valley, a command that shook the snow from the burning branches above. But I couldn't stop. The physical tether of the mate bond was pulling me toward him, yes, but the older, more desperate bond of a mother was screaming in my ears, drowning out the sound of the wind, the crackle of the fires, and the heavy, rhythmic thuds of the Alpha King's boots pursuing me. As we broke through the final line of burning pines, the horror of the scene was laid bare. A squad of 5 elite obsidian trackers stood outside the crumbling stone foundation of the mill. They weren't fighting the fire. They were guarding the only exit from the subterranean cellar. One of them, a towering lieutenant with a face heavily scarred by silver burns, held an iron canister of liquid silver, systematically pouring the glowing pale blue poison down into the wooden cellar slats. The foul, rotting odor of the chemical rose into the air, thick enough to make my stomach violently heave. "Pour it all," the lieutenant growled, his voice a low, wet rumble beneath his rusted steel mask. "Gideon said the whelp has the Purifier's scent. We don't leave until the cellar is a tomb of black meat." "Step away from the door," my voice cut through the roar of the flames. It wasn't a scream, it was a whisper, but it carried the chilling, absolute resonance of an ancient queen commanding her executioners. I stopped 20 paces from them, my feet buried in the bloody snow, my tattered wool dress fluttering beneath Maddox's grand mantle. My eyes were entirely blind with starlight white fire, the silver veins on my face pulsing in perfect sync with the frantic, terrified heartbeat of my son that I could suddenly feel through the earth. The 5 trackers spun around, their hands instantly flying to their heavy, silver-plated daggers and mechanical bows. "The Omega," the lieutenant whispered, his eyes widening behind the steel slits of his mask as he recognized my face from the old banishment logs. Then his gaze shifted upward, and the blood drained entirely from his visible jawline. Maddox had stepped out of the smoke beside me. The king was a vision of absolute destruction. His bare chest was smeared with the black ash of the valley and the dark blood of the guards he had slaughtered on the mountain path. The golden fire in his eyes was so bright it cast a physical glow onto the snow before him, and the monstrous, half-shifted muscles of his shoulders were coiled like steel springs, ready to snap. The air around him was warped by the sheer, suffocating density of his alpha aura, forcing the very flames of the mill to bend away from his presence. "You have 5 seconds to pray to the first alphas," Maddox murmured. The low frequency of his voice was so deep it caused the iron canister in the lieutenant's hand to vibrate, the liquid silver inside sloshing violently. "Because after that, I'm going to paint this mill with your entrails." "Kill them both!" the lieutenant shrieked, his professional discipline completely fracturing under the weight of the king's presence. 3 trackers raised their crossbows, their fingers snapping the triggers. 3 silver-tipped bolts hissed through the freezing air, aimed directly at my throat and Maddox's chest. I didn't move. I simply lifted my right hand, my small, calloused fingers opening toward the oncoming projectiles. The Purifier bloodline within me answered with a violent, beautiful explosion of lunar light. A solid wall of silver-white energy materialized in the air before us. When the poisoned bolts struck the barrier, there was no impact. The liquid silver on the tips was instantly neutralized, turning into harmless, gray dust that fell silently into the snow. The sheer kinetic backlash of my magic blew the rusted steel masks right off the trackers' faces, revealing their pale, horror-struck features. Before they could reorient, Maddox moved. He was a shadow crossing the white snow, a predator of unmatched, catastrophic velocity. He closed the distance in a fraction of a heartbeat. His left hand caught the first tracker by the throat, his obsidian claws sinking deep into the spine and ripping the man's head completely clean from his shoulders with a wet, tearing sound. Without breaking momentum, Maddox pivoted, his right elbow driving backward into the chest of the second tracker. The iron armor plate shattered inward, the fragments of metal piercing the man's heart as he was launched 20 feet into the burning timber of the mill, his body consumed by the flames instantly. The lieutenant and the remaining 2 guards backed away, their boots slipping on the bloody ice, their weapons discarded as their inner wolves completely succumbed to the terrifying realization of who they were fighting. "Maddox, the cellar!" I cried out, my starlight white vision tracking a sudden, catastrophic shift in the burning structure above. The main support beam of the grain mill, a massive, charred column of ancient oak, was cracking under the weight of the collapsed roof. It was tilting directly toward the wooden cellar door where my son was trapped. If it fell, the stone entrance would be pulverized, sealing the cellar under tons of burning debris and liquid silver poison. Maddox looked at the beam, then looked at the remaining 3 rebels. The choice between slaughtering his enemies and saving the child was instantaneous. "Evangeline, go!" he roared, his voice a low, commanding rumble that gave my legs a sudden, magical surge of adrenaline. He lunged toward the collapsing structure, his massive arms reaching upward as the 5-ton burning beam came crashing down. With a primal, earth-shaking roar that tore the breath from my lungs, the Beast King caught the burning oak beam with his bare hands. The fire scorched his skin, the scent of burning flesh and molten gold filling the air as his muscles bunched to their absolute limits, his boots sinking 6 inches into the frozen earth under the immense weight. He held the entire burning roof of the mill on his shoulders, his golden eyes locked onto me through the smoke. "Get him out!" he growled, the raw agony and unyielding devotion in his voice making the mate bond scream in my chest. I ran past him, ignoring the heat that threatened to singe my hair. I threw myself onto my knees in the wet, silver-stained mud beside the cellar doors. The wooden slats were burning, the pale blue liquid silver hissing and bubbling in the crevices. A normal Omega would have been burned to the bone by the poison, but as my hands touched the white-hot wood, the Purifier light in my veins surged, a cool silver frost spreading from my palms, neutralizing the silver and extinguishing the flames beneath my fingers. I ripped the charred wood away with a desperate, unnatural strength, shattering the iron padlock with a final, violent burst of my inner wolf's energy. I pulled the heavy doors open and tumbled down the dark stone steps into the cellar. The air inside was thick with gray smoke and the terrifying chemical sting of the poison leaking through the ceiling. In the far corner, tucked beneath a crumbling stone archway, lay a small, ragged bundle of gray wool. "Leo!" I gasped, scrambling through the debris, my knees scraping against the sharp gravel. I reached the bundle and pulled it into my arms. My little boy was burning, not from the fire outside, but from the vicious, suffocating chest fever that had plagued him for weeks. His skin was translucent, his tiny cheeks smudged with soot, his breathing a shallow, rattling whistle that broke my heart into 1,000 pieces. But as my arms wrapped around him, his tiny, premature wolf gave a faint, weak whimper of recognition against my chest. "Mommy," he whispered, his tiny, cold hand clutching at the collar of my tattered wool dress. "I have you, my love," I choked out, tears finally breaking through my steel spine, tracking clean lines through the soot on my face. "I have you. You're safe." I tucked him securely beneath the heavy, fur-lined velvet of Maddox's royal cloak, shielding his fragile lungs from the smoke, and turned back toward the stone steps. Above us, the mill gave a final, fatal groan. The heat was becoming unbearable, the stone walls of the cellar beginning to crack under the immense pressure of the collapsing upper floors. I scrambled up the stairs, my arms holding my son tightly against my heart, my breath coming in ragged, painful gasps. As I broke through the cellar threshold into the freezing night air, the final wall of the grain mill gave way. Maddox was still there, a dark, bleeding titan holding the central beam, his skin blistered by the fire, his golden eyes wild with a feral, protective madness. The remaining two rebels, seeing their chance, had drawn their silver daggers and were lunging at his unprotected flanks while he was pinned under the weight of the timber. "No!" I screamed. The sound of my voice triggered something primal in the king. He didn't wait for the daggers to strike. With a final, monstrous heave of his scarred shoulders, Maddox hurled the 5-ton burning beam directly at the two attackers, crushing them beneath the flaming wood with a final, muffled shriek. The structure behind him collapsed into a massive, roaring mountain of ash and fire. Maddox stood in the snow, his chest heaving, his bare skin covered in soot, blood, and severe burns. He looked like a demon crawled out of the mouth of hell. But as his golden eyes landed on me, and on the small, velvet-wrapped bundle in my arms, the lethal tension in his massive frame vanished instantly. He walked toward us, his heavy boots dragging in the snow, his hands trembling as he reached out. He didn't look at his injuries. He didn't look at the burning valley around us. His entire universe had narrowed down to the three of us. He stopped an inch away, his large, warm hand gently pulling back the edge of the velvet cloak to reveal Leo's small, pale face. The little boy blinked weakly, his feverish eyes catching the golden glow of the king's gaze. Leo didn't cry. Instead, his tiny hand reached out, his small fingers brushing against the rough, soot-stained skin of Maddox's wrist. The mate bond didn't just flare, it settled deep into the earth, a heavy, unyielding anchor that bound the three of us together across bloodlines, across kingdoms, and across time. The king's inner wolf let out a low, deep purr, a sound of absolute possession and fierce, protective love. "He has your spine, Evangeline," Maddox whispered, his low baritone thick with an emotion he had never allowed himself to feel before. He looked up from the boy's face to lock his golden eyes onto mine, his hand sliding up to cup the back of my neck, pulling my forehead gently against his hard, warm chest. "The valley is cleared. The traitors are dead. Now we take our son home, and we show this continent what happens when someone touches the family of the Beast King."